I'm here with Matt Watson, who was previously the founder and CEO at Stackify. He sold that company in 2021 to NetTrio. He's currently running Full Scale. He's the founder and CEO there. They are an outsourcing and outsourcing company for software development. They're around 300 people, what it looks like on LinkedIn. And Matt is very, very active on LinkedIn. He's putting out a lot of content. He's creating incredible content. Just his post from one day ago went viral and got 2,500 likes. He has almost 50,000 followers on there. He's running his own podcast. I think you have 3,000 plus podcast episodes, something like that. Was that the stat that I heard? Or 1,000 plus?
There's about 1,300 podcasts.
1,300. Insane. So clearly when it comes to funnel-led marketing, Matt is the right person to talk to. Matt, anything in terms of that intro that I skipped over or should have mentioned? Anything else you want to add to that?
And I'm charming and handsome.
Awesome. Love it. Cool. All right. Let's dive in. I mean, maybe let's start with your journey about creating content. I mean, it seems like a lot of your time is spent on doing marketing, creating content, posting on LinkedIn, recording podcasts. How much of your day-to-day time would you say is dedicated to marketing?
I would say currently it's probably 25%, maybe some days it's 50% of my time. But I've honestly been doing this for 20 years. For my very first companies I ever had, it was like, okay, I built something, how do I promote it? And I would have to spend time trying to promote it online. And so I've actually been doing this in one form or another basically my entire career.
So 25 years ago, it was what, 1990? What do you do?
1999.
Write blog posts? Did that exist back then?
Well, yes. So, I mean, actually, if you want to get really, really funny story, I had a multi-level marketing business for a while that I would email people and spam them and try and get them to buy my vitamins online. And
nice.
I don't know, a long time ago, you get these emails about like, send $5 to each of these people. And then you email these people and ask them to send $5 to you or whatever. And I did some dumb thing. Again, this was like over 25 years ago, where I would mail people and they were supposed to send me $5, and then it was like a chain letter thing. I got so many people sending me like $5 in the mail that the post office actually came to me and asked me like, what are you doing? And so those were some of my first adventures in marketing 25 years ago. Not my proudest moments, but that's where I started.
So we call it the Founder and Marketing Show. Do you agree with that term? Is that a good way for you to think about this, or do you think about this in a completely different framework when you think about what you do spend 25 to 50% of your time on?
No, I think that's a right way to think about it a lot. And I think people that are generally my persona, so my background is more in engineering. And again, that's why I'm emailing people, because it was easy to email people. I didn't have to do real marketing back then, 25 years ago. But most people that are my persona are engineers. They're very logical. They're more like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. They are not marketing people. I always joke that software developers they can't talk to customers and they can't talk to girls. That's always my joke. I know that's not the most appropriate joke, but a lot of times it's true, right? We just don't have the personality or communication skills. And for a lot of companies, it's super critical, right? Okay, you built this cool thing, but you don't know how to sell it. You don't know how to go out and tell the world about it. And I wrote an article on my newsletter about this the other day. And one of the things I said is just think about like you're just telling people about the cool thing you built. Just go tell, you're proud of what you built. Just go tell people about the cool thing that you built. Like just at least go do that. Like at a minimum, if you can do that, that will go a long ways. And that fits in perfectly with the founder-led marketing.
Right. And I guess to comment on that, the way that I see founder-led sales, which a lot of people are familiar with, translates into founder-led marketing. Or the difference is that founder-led sales is one-to-one. If you send a cold email, if you do a cold call, if you have a demo with a prospect, that's one-to-one, which is limited in terms of the scale and the bandwidth that you as one founder can do with your 24 hours in a day. Founder-led marketing is the same concept, but you do it in a scaled way where you might write a blog post, you might send out an email newsletter, you might record a podcast, you might put out a LinkedIn post where you spend that time to produce that piece of content once, but then hundreds of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people can all consume that one piece of content. So it's scaled. It's a one-to-many approach rather than a one-to-one approach with sales.
Well, and so how I really got started with this 20 years ago, founded a company called Vin Solutions, and we were selling CRM software to car dealerships. And I would go into the online communities and I would engage in online communities that were other car dealers and industry people were on there. And so I would contribute to those groups and, try and mention us and whatever. And then I would also write content on our website. Like I would do blogging because I wanted to rank. Like somebody Googled automotive CRM system. Like I wanted to rank number one on Google. Like that was my life goal for a long time. And eventually I got us onto the first page of Google. So again, it's like, what else could I do? Like as the founder, I was trying to figure out what can I do to help us with marketing without having a huge marketing budget. And so, yeah, it was a lot of engaging in online communities, writing content. And then you mentioned Stackify earlier. So we exited Vin Solutions, and actually the marketing that worked the best for that was just cold calling. We had 50 people that cold call people all day. That's what really helped us scale. But at Stackify, that didn't work at all. Like we tried other kinds of marketing. We tried just paid ads and sponsoring conferences and different things. None of it worked very well. But what did work for us pretty well is blogging. And so we would write blog posts and that worked. And then eventually we figured out we need to double down on that. And so I wrote hundreds of blog posts myself, hundreds over several years of time. And we grew Stackify to over 10 million website visitors a year on our website.
Wow.
10 million website visitors a year going to our website. Like it didn't matter what you searched on Google about. Our software had to do with application performance. So people would Google about like JavaScript logging best practices or Java server performance, like all these things like that. And we would rank. And so I spent a ton of my time for that. I also spent some time back then on LinkedIn. I had got a bot and I was making like LinkedIn connections with people and doing that kind of stuff. Again, that was like 10 or 15 years ago now. That's how I got started on LinkedIn as well, like 10 or 15 years ago. And going back about 2 years ago, I only had about 14,000 connections on LinkedIn that were kind of left over from that previous era of doing just LinkedIn connections.
So
So that was kind of like the real backstory of my marketing experience.
Yeah. So the main company that you're currently running, Full Scale, you guys have 300 people. You guys do software development outsourcing. So just for context for people, what's your buyer? Who's your ICP?
So most of our customers are other founders or CTOs of SaaS companies. About 70% of our customers are that. And then we have some other mid-market and even enterprise accounts as well as customers, but a lot of them are founders. And so my podcast is called the Startup Hustle Podcast, and my friend and I started the podcast as something fun to do back in like 2017, I think. And then later we started Full Scale together. So we actually started the podcast and then we started the business together because I needed to hire software developers. He had a few employees in the Philippines. I was like, okay, fine. We'll like set up a little office there. It kind of turned into an actual business into what Full Scale is today. So we provide software development for all sorts of different companies from the Philippines because it's extremely cost affordable to hire developers there. But then we decided, okay, well, how do we really use the podcast to grow the business? And so then the podcast became a huge marketing angle for us.
I'm going to dive into that because I think your podcast strategy is really smart. How much of your new business would you say for Full Scale can you associate to your content across all those channels, the founder-led marketing, your personal brand? Can you associate some number?
Yeah, it's about 60 to 70% of it.
Wow. And like, can you give me a range? Are we talking in the 6 figures, 7 figures on a yearly basis?
So in Q1 this year, that was about $1 million annual revenue.
So in Q1, in 3 months, overall, or your content contributed $1 million in revenue?
My content.
Holy cow.
$1 million.
So about, let's say, 300 plus K per month in booked revenue that's coming through your content.
Yeah, annualized.
Annualized. Cool. ARR, which is, I think that's incredible. I think people are not realizing the power of this. And
it's a good problem and a bad problem, right? Like it sounds great, but now I'm like, that also sucks. Like, why am I 70% of the business? Like, how do we, like, that can't be good. Like we need something else besides just that, right? So it's good and bad both, right? It's really good, but our struggle is also trying to figure out, okay, we need other channels that work.
And is that because you're worried if you want to sell the company, that's a liability? Is it because you might get banned on LinkedIn? And then, like, what's the considerations there?
Just diversification and growth, right? Like how do we grow faster and in different ways? And so we're trying to do now like more with outbound and some other strategies as well. What's interesting is most of our competitors grow almost entirely through outbound. And so we're unique as we never did inbound. For like 6 years, we grew a company to 300 employees and never did outbound. It was all inbound. It was all our podcast. It was all LinkedIn, referrals, stuff like that. We were really lucky to be able to achieve that way.
Yeah. So $1 million in annualized revenue in a quarter through your content. I think the powerful thing that I just want to comment on that people don't realize, if you would be bringing in this type of revenue through, cold calling people and hopping on demo calls, you're obviously capped by the hours in the day. Content is scalable, so there's no reason why with the same amount of time input, it can't grow to 2 million, 3 million, 5 million per quarter as you grow in your LinkedIn audience, as you grow in your podcast audience, because it keeps growing, right?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
So can you I know you're doing a lot of things. Can you list all the things that you do in between like LinkedIn, newsletter? Like what are your main channels right now?
So the main things I do today is we do the podcast. A long time ago, we were doing the podcast 4 or 5 days a week, and then I cut it to 2 days a week.
Okay.
And for the summer, we're only doing 1 day a week. But I think we want to pick that back up, and we can talk more about the podcast strategy in detail if you want. And then I started a newsletter about 18 months ago, and have played around with different strategies with that. And what I'm doing right now is pairing it with the podcast. So the day we release the podcast, I also do a newsletter, and the newsletter is more of an in-depth, like actionable insights, something that we learned from that podcast today. And honestly, what I do most of the time is I take the podcast transcript and run it through AI and be like, okay, what were the top things? And then actually ask it to write the first draft of the newsletter ultimately. And then I, edit it and make it my own and make it sound like what I want it to sound like.
And do you use Substack or what do you use for the newsletter?
So I used to use Substack, and then I moved to Beehive for the newsletter, which I really like. Substack seems to be more based for people who want paid newsletters for a business. The main reason I moved to Beehive is it has an API. So if somebody went to our website and scheduled a call or something, I could use their API to, subscribe them to the newsletter or something. You can't do that with Substack. Beehive has been really cool. And then, so I do the podcast, I do the newsletter, and then I post on LinkedIn almost pretty much every day, sometimes twice a day. And, part of that is once you have been posting on LinkedIn for a while, you can recycle content. So you mentioned I went viral on LinkedIn yesterday. That was a post that I had posted in early 2023 that got 1 million views. And so I just reposted that from a year ago. And so we'll see how many views it gets this time. But
it's already at 2,500 likes. So that might be getting close, huh? That might be getting close.
I don't know. I'm gonna check the numbers while we sit here.
My post that got 1,000 likes ended up getting, I think, 250,000 impressions. So with that amount of likes, you're probably approaching the million, I'm guessing. I don't know.
So I'm at 223,000 right now. And the real key to getting a lot of views is the repost. The more people will repost it and reshare it with their network or add other thoughts to it, really amplifies it. And the big thing that I've seen over the last couple of years of doing this is the really good post. It seems like LinkedIn will keep, showing that content for up to about a week. So if you have something that's really good, it'll just keep getting more and more impressions over like a whole week of time.
Right. So you got your podcast, you got your newsletter, you got your LinkedIn. Anything else going on?
Well, I've thought about writing a book. I've played around before with doing video stuff on TikTok and things, but I decided to stop doing that. Honestly, we haven't had much luck at all with video. And the problem with all these things is trying to figure out which ones you can track, a true ROI to, right? Like that's one of the hardest things about this kind of marketing is like, okay, I do the podcast, I do the newsletter, I post on LinkedIn. What do we get out of this? I think that's the hardest part is being able to really track it. The only way we track it is when our salespeople talk to people. They're like, oh, I've followed your founder on LinkedIn for a long time and blah, blah, blah. Like it's not as measurable.
Right. And why is that a problem, though? Isn't that still attributable? If the salesperson asks, how did you hear
It's
about
not a
us?
problem. Yeah, it's not a problem, but it makes it hard on a daily basis to know, like, I pour all this energy into this newsletter, I write the newsletter, I don't know if anybody cares.
Right.
That part of it's hard, right? Like, you just don't know. You pour your heart into some piece of content and you put it out there and you're like, I don't know if people really like this thing or not.
So between the podcast, the newsletter, and the LinkedIn, and I'm guessing because the newsletter is more or less a distribution, a strategy for the podcast, if you could only keep doing one of those things, which one would it be?
That's a really good question. I think probably LinkedIn would probably be the one I would is the most important.
Why?
Because I think ultimately that's where you can have conversations and really connect with people. If anything, the podcast and the newsletter all help create content that you can post on LinkedIn, right? And so I mentioned before at StackFi, I wrote like hundreds of blog posts. I mean, I would spend hours writing a single blog post, where a podcast like this, we can sit down and record it in 1 hour. And then maybe there's another half an hour of like production time or something behind the scenes that somebody else can do. Like, we don't have to do it. And if you're using AI to help with newsletter or even the LinkedIn stuff, it can kind of do like, AI can help with like half of that work or 80% of that work maybe. And then you can spend some more time to fine tune it. So I think that's the great thing about the podcast is you can, actually, like, we could take the podcast today, right? And you could probably write 5 newsletter articles about different things that we talk about, right? Like, if you wanted to, like, you could explode it in a whole bunch of different things.
Yep.
And a whole bunch of different LinkedIn content. I usually have so many things to post about on LinkedIn that I don't do that, but I absolutely could, right? Like, for each podcast guest, there's probably 3 or 4 like things that we discussed or whatever that could all be posted about on LinkedIn. And so I think that part about it is great, right? You have like weekly inspirations and content ideas from talking to other thought leaders or whatever in your space, whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah. So the podcast is almost like a content ideation machine, but the real distribution and reach happens on LinkedIn.
For sure. I mean, as you know, you host a podcast, you publish a podcast and you may get 100 listeners, 500 listeners, 1,000 listeners, right? Like, it's really hard to grow a podcast and get like thousands of downloads for every episode. Is super difficult.
Yep.
But it's pretty easy to get thousands of views on LinkedIn. Right. So it's just a great distribution channel for whatever the thought leadership is that you have. It's just kind of unrivaled. But the podcast has other advantages too. Maybe we'll talk more about.
Yeah. So we'll get to the podcast. LinkedIn now. I mean, people should definitely check out your LinkedIn and look at your content to get a feel for kind of what you talk about, how you talk about it. I mean, obviously you're posting once a day. You have kind of like a wide, let's say, range of how a post might do. Like, your post from yesterday got like 2,500 likes, and the post right before that got like 3 likes or something like that, which I think is also really insightful for people to understand the algorithm a little bit. Like, followers, in my opinion, matter way less than just how good the piece of content is. Like, you might have 50,000 followers. If the topic isn't resonating, you're still not going to get any likes. And if you have 1,000 followers, but you post something really interesting and valuable, like, you'll get way beyond 1,000 impressions because it's going to keep rolling out and people want to engage with it and share with it. So that's just one point here. But how do you think about your LinkedIn strategy? Let's just start there as an overall way. What's your framework to think about it?
Well, it starts with tofu, and then you get to mofu, and then bofu, right? Tofu is top of the funnel, mofu is middle of the funnel, and bofu is the bottom of the funnel. First time somebody said that to me one day, I'm like, why do you call this tofu, mofu, book? Like, it's so confusing. But so I'm sharing that funness with you today. But that's how the strategy I have to think about, right? Like, to your point, that post only got a couple thousand impressions on LinkedIn, which for me is low. Like, not much gets lower than about a couple thousand. But did just the right people see those 2,000? And one of them, I think, was a lead. I think I got a lead yesterday from one of those 2,000, right? So again, it's all about top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel. And so when you're creating your content strategy, my post that got 200,000 views yesterday was very top of the funnel. I probably may not get a lot of leads from that, right? But I might get a lot of followers, right? And then those new followers, eventually they may follow me for a few months and whatever, and maybe get another lead out of them, right? So you have to think about, I think about like the strategy of you have to do some top of the funnel stuff to grow your audience, and then you have a different set of content to nurture that audience. So you go through both. Like, how do I grow it? How do I nurture it? How do I grow it? How do I nurture it? And that's how I think about it. And somebody else, their strategy was like, okay, 3 times a week I post about top of the funnel. 1 time a week it's middle of the funnel, and then one day a week it's bottom of the funnel. Like some kind of strategy like that, where it's a mixture of those things. And you have to remember, like 5% of the people that follow you on LinkedIn probably see whatever you post. And so not everybody's sitting on LinkedIn all day long scrolling through and reading every single thing there is, right? So you've got to keep putting out the same messaging over and over and over again, because not everybody's going to see it.
So you're selling to founders, you're selling software development services. So for your ICP, for your topic, you're obviously talking about software development. Can you give me an example, let's say, for each top of funnel, middle of funnel, bottom of funnel? Like give me a directional of what that might mean for a post, what the topic might be, or what direction it's taking.
Yeah, and I would say my strategy for this continues to evolve. I don't think I have like the perfect, like, this is my exact ICP and I need to cover these exact 3 topics. I think I probably wander around in a lot of different areas, and maybe I'm not as strict about the exact content strategy, but I guess I'm okay with that. I generally post content about startups, SaaS companies, targeting other tech founders, tech leaders, engineering leaders, which are all kind of our ICP in general. So a lot of the content will be about just startup related stuff, product development, building software, SaaS. Like it's just kind of general startup related stuff, tech related stuff.
That's top of funnel.
I don't post like top of funnel.
And so this is like a lesson or like a snarky little insight, or give me one specific example of something that might go into top of funnel.
Yeah. So like the one yesterday was about how companies they don't need rock star software developers. They need rock star requirements, because the hardest part about software development is actually getting good requirements. And so that's why the topic takes off and goes viral.
Yeah.
And after you do this for a while, you know what topics work really well. Like, you know, the triggers. And part of the reason that topic goes so well is there's so many people comment on it, because some people agree or they disagree, right? So everybody jumps in and they're like, this is 100% right. And then other people jump in, they're like, this is terrible. I hate this. Like, you're so wrong. Like, that's the best kind of content that it goes viral, right? It needs to be agitation content. And I've actually went on like ChatGPT before and asked it like, okay, what are the topics for what I do that are the most polarizing, agitative, controversial content topics, right? Like you do some research, get a list of like all these potential topics that are sort of controversial, and then figure out, okay, these are the right kind of ones I would want to post about. And then sometimes you have to delicately figure out, okay, how do I post about this topic or ask the question the right way? If it's something that is that polarizing, like not to get political, but if it was about abortion or something, right? You're like, how do I bring up this topic in a way that doesn't make me like half my audience hate me, right? So sometimes you have to figure out how to, walk the fine line of like, okay, how do I bring up this topic in the right way that I get everybody else to come argue about it? And I just get a lot of impressions because everybody else comes and argues about it, right? So sometimes you just have to figure out how to walk that line, but it can be, that's the best kind of content. And so I know several different of those topics that if I post about that topic, a lot of people will like come out of the woodwork and come comment about it.
I would say maybe one more thing that I would add that, maybe you disagree on that, but being polarizing is one thing. You need to actually also believe it, because otherwise you lose credibility. And when you say, hey, you don't need rockstar developers, you need clear requirements, it's polarizing, but you also actually believe in it. You're not making some statement just to agitate someone. Like it's a strong opinion that will be polarizing, and you actually believe in it, and that's the key part.
Yeah. Well, and part of the reason I mentioned earlier about walking the fine line is sometimes it can be polarizing, it can be controversial, but you at least just want to have sound logic of why you believe this way, right? To your point, right? Like you want to back up whatever the opinion is, but you want to back it up in a solid way. So even if somebody disagrees with you, they like, well, I understand their opinion. Like, I understand why they believe this way, but I don't agree.
Right.
And now now you have rage baited me into commenting.
So how much do you use ChatGPT for your posts? Is it like every now and then, or are half of your posts the idea comes from something you prompted?
Okay, you're gonna love this. The biggest post I ever did got 3 million impressions on LinkedIn, and this was like 3 months ago. It was written by ChatGPT.
I think I know which post it is.
So
Yeah.
so it had to do with like, I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically like for serverless applications, there's really servers. Like DevOps is really this thing. I can't remember. It was like these. I can't remember what it was. Like, oh, for no code apps, there's really code. For serverless, there's really servers. I don't know. It was something like that. And so anyways, I got the inspiration for somebody else had posted like one of those things. And then I added another one or two in my head. And then I went to ChatGPT and I just told it, continue this list. And then it gave like 7 other suggestions. And I liked, most of them. I, removed a couple of them, tweaked a couple of things. I'm like, oh, this is great. And just posted it. And then it went crazy viral, super crazy viral. And so sometimes it's the weird little things like that you just kind of run with them.
So how soon will you repost that post?
So I would say once a quarter is probably pretty good. Some people might argue even faster. What I did do is I took that same formula and I came up with 2 or 3 other posts that followed the same sort of formula. And they also worked really well. They got a lot of views.
Okay, so we're soon gonna see the repost of that post because it's in 3 months.
Yeah,
you got it.
Yep.
Do you automate any other stuff? Like, do you have like auto scheduling tools? Like, what softwares do you use to besides ChatGPT? What else do you use for your LinkedIn tech stack?
Yeah. So I actually prefer Claude over ChatGPT, but I use both.
Mm-hmm.
I find Claude does a better job with writing newsletters and blogs, different stuff. I feel like it's more normal English than ChatGPT seems to be a little more weird, robotic marketing mumbo jumbo sometimes. I'm a big fan of Taplio,
mm-hmm.
which is a LinkedIn like scheduling tool. I use it to schedule everything. I use it to put in like notes and drafts. So like yesterday I'm recording a podcast with somebody. I just added like 3 drafts in there of like different ideas of like, hey, these would be great like potential topics for LinkedIn posts. I just put them in the drafts. And then every week or so, I'll go back through the drafts and then I'll finish some of them. So I really like the scheduling part of it. The great thing about Taplio too is it has different queues. So we talk about tofu and bofu, top of the funnel, bottom of the funnel. You can have a different queue in there. So you can have a top of the funnel queue that maybe every morning at 8 a.m. you post some kind of top of the funnel content or whatever. But they're like, hey, Wednesday afternoons, I always post, something that's a little more product marketing about our company or whatever. And so you can have different queues. And so I use it for that. I actually used it for the recycling of content. So I actually like every Tuesday morning, I was going to post like a recycling piece. So that way I could just spread them out. It's like I just queued them up over like 12 weeks. I just put them all in the queue, 1 a week, and just put them in there. So that's one of the things I like about it too, if you kind of get more advanced. LinkedIn does have built-in scheduling now. It didn't used to, but Taplio scheduling is really nice, and it has a bunch of other features that can give you like inspirations and different things and whatever. I don't really use those. I honestly don't recommend using AI to write LinkedIn content at all. I think it's a terrible idea. I mean, it can help give you some ideas and some suggestions. I told you my one that most went viral, it wrote, but I wrote the first 2 to 3 sentences of it, and it wrote the rest of it, and then I still tweaked it. But generally speaking, I feel like AI does not create like very compelling, hooky, actionable, like kind of content. It's like just boring.
Right.
Not really a fan.
Right. And so you actually use
not for short form.
You actually use the scheduling tool, because there are some opinion that using a scheduling tool rather than going on LinkedIn, pasting the copy and actually hitting the publishing button has a negative effect on your reach. But it seems to not really affect you, or you don't see it, or you don't feel that that's the case.
I don't see it. The things I think that have the most negative reach actually are using a lot of times photo and video. I think images and video don't work very well on LinkedIn unless you have really, really good images and just the right video and stuff. Actually, I think don't have as many impressions either.
It's actually really interesting. I believe anything works. It's just whatever works for you, and some people have different strength. Because some people are like religiously, they only post carousels, and they say, whenever I don't post a carousel, it just doesn't do as well. Some people use these like infographic images that are just like sheets, and they do that every time.
Yes.
Other people are like I attach the Selfies for every post. And if you don't attach a selfie, it's not going to do as well.
Yep.
I just think, anything at work, it's just like, I don't know, maybe the selfie people are especially beautiful people. And so that's why it works for them. I don't know. But
no, I think the key is whatever those strategies you just mentioned, they all work if you do a really good job at them. What does not work from my perspective is some terrible stock photo.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Like people will see this terrible and they will forget it.
Yep.
If you're going to post an image, there's got to be a reason why. It's got to be intriguing. It's got to get people to stop and look at it. If it's like super boring or looks like an ad or whatever, people just go right by it.
Yeah.
It's got to be the right kind of images. I have a friend of mine on LinkedIn who always posts selfies, and this is not an attractive person by any means. And a lot of times their photos are just actually kind of really goofy. But you know what? They catch me every time because I'm like, oh, there's my friend. And I stop every time and I read because I see their selfie and I read it. And they put out amazing content. But that's kind of their thing. They always put these goofy selfies with every one of their posts. But that's how you know it's them immediately and you stop and read it.
Yeah.
So I think to your point, I think all these strategies work if you do them at a high level.
Yeah. Elena Verna, PLG person at Dropbox, she posts only memes and they're just crushing every time. But it's not like people then think like, oh, I got to post memes, but then it's just a bad meme or an uninteresting meme or a meme that a million people have already seen. So it's not really new, or the thing that you write alongside the meme is not really interesting. So yeah, it's just anything at work. It's just got to fit your style and you got to get really good at that one thing. And so some people are great at video. Chris Walker only posts videos, right? So you got to find your style and then just get good at that thing. Okay, we talked about top of funnel. What might be an example of a middle of funnel post for you?
So honestly, middle of the funnel and bottom of the funnel start to blur for me. But I think so like middle and bottom of the funnel is more usually about offshore software development, the Philippines, like why should you hire software developers in the Philippines, like what we do that's different, why people like what we do, all that kind of stuff. So it's usually a lot more of that kind of content.
What besides, that, what have you learned around how to structure LinkedIn posts, how to write a hook, how to pick a topic, maybe some of your patterns or themes that you incorporate into posts? Anything there around like what you pay attention to when you write a post?
I think the hooks are everything. Like you've got to have a really good hook. It's got to be interesting and intriguing. You got to get people to click, read more and dig in, right? I'm also a fan of the smaller, shorter sentences and using bullet points and stuff like that. A lot of people don't like reading walls of text, right? They like skimming through things. I think using emojis is cool and good, but the ones that use too many of them, I think it looks stupid and gimmicky. So I think there's a right balance of using them. So I don't know, man. I think I'm sure it's the same thing. We're like, well, there's 7 different ways to do this and all 7 of them work for different people for different reasons.
Yeah.
But I prefer a lot of my content ends up being kind of longer, where it'll be like 10 or 12 sentences or something like that. It'll be kind of a longer post. And that's actually how I started kind of writing my blog, actually, is I would go to write these LinkedIn posts. It would be like 12 sentences. I'm like, man, this could be a whole blog. Like I could write 1,000 words about this thing. And then I would take it to like ChatGPT and tell it to turn it into a blog, and it would crush it. Like that's actually one of the better uses of Claude and ChatGPT is like taking like a really long like thought leadership post and then telling it to expand it to a blog. Actually works really well.
Interesting.
Yeah. So a lot of my posts seem to be kind of longer.
So I want to highlight one thing, which maybe you have a comment on. I think one of the other reasons why your content does well is because your audience is founders and CEOs and tech people looking for developers. You are a founder. You are a CEO. You've previously been a CTO who had to hire developers. So like you speak their language, you are them, you think like them, you've been in this industry for many, many, many years. You've had to hire your own developers, so you know what other founders and CEOs care about when they hire developers, which is obviously what you do for companies. So is there anything more to say to that? That obviously that's a big factor on why your content regularly does really well and resonates?
I think that's the key, is being authentic and relatable and transparent, and people being able to read your content and be like, this guy gets it. Like he understands my life. I've had similar experiences. Like he has unique angles, learnings, sharings that like I can relate to these things. Like we've obviously been in the same situations before, right? Like that kind of thought leadership is really important to really engage with your audience versus if you just, post this just like super generic crap, like it's not as engaging, right? It's that more engaging content that really relates to people. And it can be the weirdest, probably random nuanced things, right? But it's those little random nuances where people like really engage with like, man, this person gets it. Like they really get it. And that's how they really become a follower. Like, hey, I like this Watson guy. He always posts these really interesting, intriguing, weird little things. If you really want to learn the like in the trenches of like how to start a company and the learnings, like he really gets it. I could go read this like generic advice anywhere. I could just go Google this generic advice, but like this like raw, like, behind the scenes information, like little things that I can relate to, I think is what really, people really like to see.
So if a founder or CEO would come to you, they're running a tech company, they're running a SaaS company, and they like see you, they see Chris Walker, they see Adam Robinson, they see some of these people crushing on LinkedIn, and they're like, Matt, should I do this? What things would you be asking them? What requirements would you say? What things would you be looking at to determine whether you would tell them yes or no, or wait, or here's how to approach it? Like, how would you answer that question if they come to you and they're like, should I do this too?
So I think it depends on what their goal is, right? So at full scale, for what we sell and what we do, it's almost sold entirely based on trust and referrals. It's networking. Like people don't get like some email and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to hire a developer for this person, right? Like people don't usually do that, right? So we know from what we do that networking, building trust, all that stuff is really important. Okay. So our podcast does that. The newsletter does that. LinkedIn does that. You're like, yeah, I've been following this guy for a while. I like this guy. If next time I think about needing this service, I'm going to remember him. I remember this person and be like, okay, I'm going to reach out to them, right? Like that's what you're trying to build over a longer period of time. You're trying to build that kind of trust. If that's what you do and the type of business that you have, that I think that's important. Now, if you're like, hey, I own an e-commerce business where I sell shoes, like maybe posting on LinkedIn is not the best fit for you, right? So I think it depends if you're the type of B2B business you have and what you're trying to do and accomplish. Is your audience on there? I mean, I think there's also other people that do this, and this is one of the reasons I started doing it. I'm like, you know what? Even if this is a long-term thing and it'll take 5 years to really grow my personal brand, like this will be really valuable 5 years from now. Like for whatever it is I want to do 5 years from now, right? Like, and I think if you ask yourself right now, you're like, man, I wish 5 years ago I was doing this because it would be so valuable today. Like, well, you should probably start it now because it's going to be super valuable 5 years from now also, right? And a great example of this was some guy reached out to me and they're like, Matt, I need to hire a chief technology officer. Do you know any? I'm like, I know a couple of people, but I'll do you a favor. I'll post on LinkedIn for you that I know a guy who needs to hire a CTO. I spent my whole damn weekend responding to people on LinkedIn who were messaging me about that job. Like, ended up being like a weekend job for me. I got so many people that messaged me. How powerful is that? Just from the network and the following they have, right? So to some degree, it's like, I don't know how valuable this thing is, having 50,000 followers on LinkedIn. Like, what do you do with this? But it's really valuable, right? And you can continue to figure out how to monetize it and use it no matter what it is you continue to do, right? Like, I think there's a lot of value in it in a lot of different ways.
If the next question is, okay, I want to do it, how do I start? What would you tell them?
I mean, I think I would tell you the same thing that Mr. Beast would tell you about starting a YouTube channel, right? It's like, just go create 100 videos on YouTube. They're all going to suck, and that's fine. Just go create them. Just try to get a little bit better every single day. And then after 100 of them, stop and think about like, okay, am I good at this or bad at this? Do I want to continue this, right? Like, but just go do it. Just go do it. And if you're on LinkedIn right now and you only have like 500 followers, you don't have much to lose anyways. Like, just go posting stuff. Just go do it.
Yeah. Well, and if you post something uninteresting, it's not like all of your 500 connections from back in the day are going to see it, because the algorithm is going to realize it pretty quickly, and it's just not going to show it to people. So
no,
that's kind of like a self-protecting mechanism.
Just gonna start doing it.
Like I sometimes think, oh man, this posted badly. I only got, whatever, 10 likes, but it's like at the same time, Like, that's nice because it kind of means that this post was uninteresting. And I only got a couple of people seeing this uninteresting thing that I just said. Imagine that it kept showing it to hundreds of thousands of people who are now all going to think, wow, Finn had this really uninteresting thing to say today, so
Yeah.
it's always so.
Well, and I did this with TikTok. I posted videos on TikTok every single day for like 3 months or something like that. I did like 100 of them or whatever. And I just got to the end of it. And I'm like, you know what? I don't know that there was any ROI in this. I don't know if we saw any value in this. I don't know if this is our right audience. I was not going to do this anymore. So I gave it my all for like 3 or 4 months and then decided, you know what? It's not for me.
Is that kind of the time frame, like 100 reps, 3 to 4 months, try it, and then evaluate and see?
I think so. I think that's a fair time to give it a try. For a lot of these things, it's tough, right? Like I mentioned earlier, I do the podcast, you do the newsletter, you post on LinkedIn, and sometimes it's hard. It's hard to see that attribution. But after 90 days, you're probably going to see the attribution somewhere.
Yep. So let's spend the last couple of minutes here talking about your podcast strategy. So how do you approach your podcast? How do you do it? Why do you do it that way?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of great strategies with a podcast. So when we started doing it, what we would do is actually we'll only do the podcast in person in Kansas City. So we're in Kansas City, home of Taylor Swift. We get to say that now. And actually she lives like a kilometer from me.
Oh.
We started doing is inviting guests onto the show that would be potential customers, right? So how do we use it to get the potential customers that we want to come into the office, say hi, meet them, try and build some kind of personal relationship with them. And that works great. Like that actually helped us get a lot of customers over, a longer period of time, right? Some of them, they'd come back to us months later, a year later, 2 years later. And then eventually now we do the podcast remote. I don't think that works as well as it did in person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because in person, you got to really meet the people. Maybe you would go have lunch with them, you record a podcast with them, whatever. And they were local and you'd build a relationship with them. It still works for, doing it remote, but it doesn't work quite as well as it does in person, I don't believe. But it's still a great strategy. Like it's a great thing to use to reach out to the founder of some company and say, hey, love what you do. Love to have you potentially as a guest on my podcast. Like they're way more likely to respond to that than they are some like just random promotional, material you would send them. A lot of people like the idea of their 5 minutes of fame or whatever on a podcast, and they'll listen and they'll do it. Like it's actually pretty easy to get people to be on the podcast. So it's a great type of marketing to reach out to your potential customers.
Love it. And that's still how you run the podcast. That's still the strategy behind it. It's just virtual rather than in person in the office.
I would say right now, probably about half of our podcast guests are potential customers. The other half are people like you. You're on my podcast. That is just great content as well. So it's the balance of like, okay, what helps us create great content that our audience that is listening would want to hear and learn from. And then the other half is, potential customers. So it's the balance of the two.
Right.
The strategy continues to change. I don't have it all figured out either.
Yeah. No, I love it. I tell almost every B2B company that I think a podcast is a no-brainer for them, because it's not about can you build the next top 10 podcast with millions of downloads. If you run this strategy and you just invite your ideal prospects at the target accounts that you're targeting to the podcast, the first 2 steps to any sale is first getting a foot in the door and then building trust. And if you do podcasts, you do both, because if you're going to go cold outbound to the founder or the CTO, the head of R&D, the person that you sell into, and say, hey, we have a podcast. I would love to interview you about what you're learning and what you're seeing in the market. You get a much higher response rate than if you say, hey, want to book a demo with our sales team? Because people love to talk about themselves and their experience. So they'll say yes. So you have the foot in the door now. And then 2, you now have a opportunity to chat with them for an hour about who they are, what they do, what they learn, which is a great way to build rapport and trust with someone. And then you already got the first 2 steps down of, actually getting a sale. And then from there, you can take it to wherever you want to do and you now have that asset. You have a video recording that you can upload to podcast, YouTube. You can clip it up into LinkedIn videos or transcribe it for podcasts. So it's a no-brainer, in my opinion, for a B2B company to run this playbook. All right, let's wrap up here. Thank you so much for your time. Any last bits, anything you wish I would have asked about that I didn't ask?
No, I if you guys want to subscribe to my newsletter, to startuphustlenews.com, and follow me on LinkedIn. Just look for Matt Watson. I'm sure you'll put links in the show notes.
I will.
And thank you so much for having me on today.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put in the show notes both a link to Matt's LinkedIn. You can check him out there. And then also a link to Full Scale if you guys want to check it out. And I'm going to try to find that newsletter and link it up too. And then Matt, thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thank you.